Yeah, so if you grab a cup of tea, grab something, I just want to have a conversation with you about Old Testament and what it looks like from way up high. So, first off, the Old Testament is not a collection of fables or myths. It's not a collection of fictitious stories designed to teach lessons. It is a collection of historical accounts, songs, poems, prophecies that do use imagery to communicate actual events. Um, and all of this is primarily based around one extended family, Israelites, and primarily around one member of that extended family who wouldn't be born until 400 some years after the end of the Old Testament, namely Jesus. And again, I want to give us a 30,000 foot perspective of the whole Old Testament, how it's organized, the purpose of the different authors and the sections, and why it's still relevant today. So, some of you, this may be a review. Some of this is the first time you're actually ever getting into this stuff. I hope it's interesting and helpful and inspiring for you to become a student yourself, regardless. The entire Bible, cover to cover, mine's buried under all my stuff somewhere, is, I think of it as a library of 66 books and letters written by over 40 different people in 3 different languages on 3 different continents over thousands of years. And at the same time, it can be proven that it is one book with one author and one story. There's dogs lapping it up in the background. Thank you very much. She's thirsty for the word. See what I did? Yeah, I did that. That was awful. That was lame. Okay. Like I said, it's a whole bunch, but it's also one. And what the lapping is a little distracting. I'm not gonna lie. I said it can be proven to be one. That sounds like a big statement. Another big statement is there aren't any contradictions. There's no contradictions internally. Anytime we come across something that we think is a contradiction, with just a little further study into the language or into the culture or into the history, we learn that it's not a contradiction at all. It works out fine. There's no, another big statement, no contradictions with science. There's no contradictions historically. There was a time when people were essentially doing archaeology in the Middle East with a shovel in one hand and a Bible in the other, and because they would find something that, oh, here it is in the Bible. It was lost until now. So completely trustworthy, completely accurate, and again, big statements that I'm not going to support in this context. Look for links to resources for you, which I encourage you to do, to look up on your own. Time-wise, the Old Testament itself spans about 3,600 years of time, while the New Testament only spans about 100 years. And it's this difference alone, in terms of how much time is sort of spent, that leads people to see God in kind of a skewed way. And sometimes people refer to the God of wrath in the Old Testament, and he's a God of love in the New Testament, and it's because of the amount of airtime that is covered in the Old Testament. You have thousands of years of this pattern of people and God getting close together, people rejecting God, God having to deal with them and their sin, which is where the wrath part comes in, people repenting from this judgment and getting right with God again. Because this happens over and over and over, for some reason we blame God for being a God of wrath when it's really humanity's fault for being stupid. In the New Testament, it's not even 100 years. It's from the time of Jesus' birth to the 60s AD. You see the life of Jesus and the crucifixion and the resurrection, and then you see initial church history from the 30s to the 60s before the temple is destroyed. And then it's believed that the book of Revelation, it was written along with the Gospel of John, written by the same guy. it was written in the 90s. That's why we say it covers about 100 years. And, you know, there's some significant wrath in the book of Revelation. And that's you can't hide it. You can't deny it. It's what it is. But that's kind of why you get this split view of God of wrath in the old and a God of love in the new, because the new really focuses on the gospel, which is, of course, God's love poured out through Jesus, demonstrated through Jesus. But there's a lot of correction. That's what a lot of the New Testament letters are about, and we'll get into that next week when we do a New Testament overview. Let's see. To me, the label Old Testament is a misleading label to people who aren't familiar with the Bible, though I understand why it exists. To me, a better label that communicates what it is and its relationship to the New Testament instead of the Old Testament is the beginning of the Testament, or the beginning of the covenant. The old one makes it sound like God tried this, it didn't work, it's the old one, we had to scrap that plan and come up with a new one, and that's what the New Testament is. It's God's plan B, and that's not the case at all. The Old Testament is the beginning of the covenant testament. New Testament, completion of the testament or the covenant. So it's the beginning and the end. They fit together perfectly. You really, if I didn't say this already, you can't. The Old Testament doesn't make sense without the New Testament. The New Testament doesn't really make sense without the Old Testament. They are integrated. They are a whole. They are one. That cross-reference, the Old Testament looks forward to things in the New Testament. The New Testament constantly calls back to things in the Old Testament that we need to know. In a Jewish Bible, which is different than what some people call an English Bible or a Christian Bible, there is no Old and New Testament, because for people who don't believe in Jesus, like observant religious Jews, they just have the Bible. They just have the first, well, they organize them differently. We'll get to that in a second. Genesis through Malachi, what we would call it. That's, to them, that's the Bible. That's the whole thing. A Jewish Bible is the Jewish word is the Tanakh. It's the TNK. It's pronounced Tanakh. You got to put a little phlegm there at the end. It's an acronym for the three divisions that they have to organize the Bible. T, N, and K. We'll go through those in a second. But it is these divisions. In fact, in Luke 24:44, Jesus refers to the law, the prophets, and the writings. That's TNK. That's that organization that he's referring to. So the T stands for Torah. Torah means the law. It's the first 5 books of the Bible written by Moses. It's sometimes referred to as the Pentateuch, penta meaning 5, first the 5 books. It's called the law. It's called the laws of Moses. They are, using the Greek terms that we use in an English Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And in very broad brush strokes, again, 30,000 feet looking down on all this, these 5 books cover the creation of the physical universe, the fall of mankind, the flood of the world, the narrowing down of the story. The focus of the story zooms in on one family in particular through which God would save mankind, namely Israel. How the Israelites got to Egypt, how God uses Moses to deliver the Israelites from Egypt. We have the establishment of a civil and ceremonial system of laws that would govern God's people and provide a way to overcome their sin through therefore provide them access to God. God wanted to be with his people. He doesn't want this separation. That's what sin does, is sin separates people from God, and God went to great lengths to set up a system that would illustrate, in a manner of speaking, act out what is required to have access to God, which is sacrifice for sin, all of which looks forward, are pictures of what Jesus would do. It's super cool. We'll get to that next week. So God sets up this system of laws to govern his people, to set them apart from the nations around them who were horrible, because he wanted his people to be a light. He refers to his people as a treasure. He wanted to protect them. He wanted to make them an example to what a nation that follows God looks like. So there's a lot going on there. Excuse me. Continuing on. Lastly, the purging of a generation of people who didn't trust God, people that Moses led out. Almost all of them, literally, didn't trust God in what he was going to do and what he was doing, what he was trying to do. He's like, I can't have this distrust. I can't have this lack of relationship with me go into this new land that my people are going to take over, that I've given to them. That's not going to work. And so they all essentially die off in the Sinai desert. So that's the Torah. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. In the Jewish Bible, the next section is the N. It stands for, if I can say this correctly, Nebhiim. Nebhi, with a break, I am. It means the prophets. Oh, and it's after the Torah where the organization of the rest of the Old Testament differs from an English or a Christian Bible. I'm going to go over the Jewish organization first and then swing back around and come to what Christians understand as the Old Testament, how it's organized. But in the Jewish one, the N, the prophets, it contains what Christians would refer to as Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, which are just one book. It's just Samuel. 1st and 2nd Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, then Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now that sounds weird to the Christian that some of those books are mixed together, but we'll come back as to why in a second. So that's the N. The K, TNK, Tanakh, the K stands for the writings. The writings consist of Psalms, Proverbs, Job, the Song of Songs, or Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, interestingly enough, Ezra, Nehemiah, and, lest you think I lost them, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And again, when Jesus refers to the law, the prophets, the writings, or other people in the New Testament, it's those divisions, that organization that they're working inside of. It's a reference to that process. After all, think about it. For them, that was the Bible. The scriptures was that set of books. The New Testament was literally being written as they spoke. So kind of no surprise there. So the TNK, the TNK Tanakh organization makes sense in some ways. The Christian Bible organization also makes sense. It's not better than, it's just different. But I'll have to admit that to a more Western way of thinking, the English Bible makes sense. But to an Eastern thinker, which is what Hebrews and Jews originally back then were, of course, Eastern, that process makes sense. So regardless, whatever, doesn't matter. The rest I'm going to talk about is the English, the Christian Bible organization. So in your modern Christian English Bible, after the Pentateuch, after the first 5 books, you have what are referred to as the historical books. The rest of the New Testament Old Testament, is not arranged chronologically. It's arranged in categories. But for the most part, within those categories, it is chronological, which makes, if you want to sit down, I'm going to read the Old Testament, it's not going to make sense if you have a chronological mindset because it's not arranged that way. There are Bibles that are written and arranged for you to be able to do that. And it's pretty cool to be able to do that. But that's not how it is in its normal form. But you have the historical books. These are history books. They document historical events. Starts with Joshua, and it goes all the way through Esther. And it begins with an extremely partial conquering of the land promised to the Israelites' ancestor, Abraham. Remember, it ended with that generation dying off. Well, the next generation rises up, goes into the land, and they conquer this much of what they're supposed to have, of what God promised them. Promised Abraham, 400 years before these guys, more than these guys were around. The actual promised land on a map goes from the Nile River in Egypt all the way to the Euphrates River in modern day Iraq. All of that whole big chunk, the most, if I remember correctly, the most that Israel has ever occupied is all of modern day Israel and a little bit of Jordan. That's it. They've been promised that whole swath, that whole chunk of land from the Nile, over here from your perspective, to the Euphrates. That's the promised land. They have yet to have it all, and God promises that they are going to have it all, which means at some point in the future, don't know how, they get all that land. Through these books, these historical books, the kingdom of Israel is established. There is a line of kings set up, the first of which is King Saul, who it just didn't work out for lots of reasons. But then it's changed to the family of David, and it's through David that Jesus eventually comes. But there's a line of kings that is set up. There's a civil war, and the nation divides with kings in the north and kings in the south. These books cover Israel's history through that time, through the Babylonian period in the 500s BC, and as well as the Persian Empire. The thing is, as I said, the rest of the Old Testament's not arranged chronologically, divided by kinds of writing. So it means that as you get to Psalms, for example, those are written largely around David's time. When you get to Daniel, that time period's largely referred to in towards the end of Second Chronicles. So again, it's not arranged the way we might think it should be arranged. But remember, this is 39 books with lots of different authors written over thousands of years in different languages. It's not like they all sat down and got together and said, let's make up a religion. Let's make up a system. Let's see if we can drive this thing. No, that's exactly not what happened, which is exactly why, it came from God, because it all fits together. It all integrates. Okay, after the historical books, you have what are called the poetry books, poetical books. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Songs, or Ecclesiastes, and that they're called the writing. That's or the poetical books, kind of adopting some of the same terminology from the Tanakh. The events of Job, that's a curious one, because some people want to put it. Some people say it was written. The events of it occurred during the early chapters of Genesis, after the flood. So chronologically, they suggest it fits there, and I would have no problem with that. Other people say it's not historical; it's a story. It's like Beowulf. It's like some, and you know what? Maybe it is. My own personal internal jury is out on that one. I would have no problem accepting it as a historical, factual book, even though the form of the writing is largely poetic and the arrangement's largely poetic. That doesn't mean that it's not historic at the same time. So we'll get to Job and what that's about many moons down the road. Psalms is like the hymn book of Israel. So many prophecies are tucked in Psalms. Look at Psalm 52 and then read about Jesus on the cross. And you tell me if this was contrived, if this was something somebody made up and put together, because that was written like 1,000 years before Jesus even went to the cross. But it's as though it's somebody journaling the events of Jesus' crucifixion as it was happening. Ridiculously cool and amazing and awesome, and just brain cells blown. Proverbs is interesting in that it's largely written by David's son Solomon, wisest man who ever lived. But it's kind of like a collection of tweets. It's not. There are these little couplets. Now, sometimes there's a theme of couplets, several of them strung together on the same thought, the same idea. But other times it's just like scattered. It's like you took somebody's Twitter timeline and condensed it all into one thing. And one day it's about politics, and the other day it's about being married, and another day it's about who knows what. That's kind of what Proverbs is like. It's not just Solomon. There's some other guys thrown in there too. But it's not arranged around any particular order, any particular process. It's just, these are the Proverbs of Solomon. These are the Proverbs of so-and-so. And they're all just scattered around. Very cool. Song of Solomon is, well, why don't you read it? You get back to me. You can figure out what the Song of Solomon is about. Hope you're married when you read it. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Ecclesiastes is also written by Solomon and is labeled by some as a very depressing book. When you read it and you get to the end, it's really not a depressing book at all. It's a process book. It's Solomon processing through. Man, the conclusion he gets to at the end is like, life is really pointless unless you're loving and serving God. That's kind of what it boils down to. One of the richest humans to ever live, one of the probably the wisest human to ever live, apart from Jesus. And he says it's all empty. It's all as nothing without God. So from one perspective, I could see why some people think it's depressing. People don't really know God. While at the same time, it's like, dude, cuts to the point. Where are we? Let's see. That's pretty much makes up the poetical books. Finally, the last chunk of the Old Testament is what are called the prophets. Kind of like in the Tanakh, they had the prophets, but they had included some that the Christian Bible doesn't consider as prophetic, even though there's prophets in it. It's just, again, it's a different way of collecting and organizing stuff. You have Lamentations through Malachi. Now, this substantial chunk of books is broken down into two chunks further, which are the major prophets and the minor prophets. And again, unfortunate labeling. The major prophets has nothing to do with them being more important than the minor prophets. It's the length of the writing. The major prophets, bigger books, longer books. The minor prophets, typically shorter books. Let's see. Lamentations, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel make up the major or the longer prophets, and the rest of them make up the minor prophets. And full confession, I can't list them in order. I think I might even miss a couple if I had to list the names of those books. And my brain just doesn't hang on to all that super important stuff, but I would so lose in Awana Bible Bingo. It just wouldn't happen. There's so much going on in all these books that it's hard to summarize it, or even just pick a few highlights, because it's like literally, it's intense. It's not as easy to dismiss as people would like it to be, because while a lot of it has been fulfilled in the past, so much of it has yet to be fulfilled. And because of its reliable track record in the past, we have a very good reason to trust it for the future. You might, some people are like, well, they're internal, so of course they're going to be fulfilled. Again, these people weren't like in cahoots. It's not like they could get together and have meetings or send emails or texts to each other to collude on all of it. For example, there was a King Cyrus. The prophet Isaiah, given prophecy by God, names Cyrus 150 years, I think, before he's even born. By name, not written in after the fact, but predicted that he would be involved in letting the Israelites go back and rebuild. And in fact, there's something called the Cyrus Cylinder. It's an artifact in the British Museum that I've seen a couple of times, and with instructions on sending people back and it being cool. Prophet Jeremiah predicting that the Babylonian captivity would last 70 years. And then you have Daniel came after Jeremiah, reading Jeremiah's scroll, seeing this and saying, you know what, 70 years, doing the math, that's now, which leads him to pray for what's coming next. And as a result of that prayer, God sends an angel named Gabriel who gives Daniel this 4-verse prophecy that is mind-blowing, that I'm not going to go into the details of, except to highlight a couple of things that are connected. One of them is he's given a mathematical prophecy that has a beginning and an end point that are referenced historically. In the prophecy, he says, you know, Daniel and whoever's alive when this happens, when you see this event happen, you start counting time, and at the end of this amount of time, this event will happen. And it has to do with the order being given to rebuild the city and the walls of Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince is come and killed. When you do the math, it happened to the day. 400 and just lost it. I made 483 years to the day it happened. Made up, wasn't gone back and written in. Mathematically happened. The other event that is referenced is called the Abomination of Desolation. And what it means is in the Jewish temple that was built under David had the plans for, Solomon's the guy who actually built it, loosely, well, medium, I don't know, based on the tabernacle and the plans and how it looked, had an altar that they would sacrifice the lambs on, the altar of sacrifice. This event it's something that it's an abominable act that makes desolate. And Jesus makes a reference to it still happening in the future from his time perspective. However, there was an event that was considered the abomination of desolation before Jesus was even born. This is one of those things, there's an instance where prophecy is not just a single prediction, which is how we Westerners like to think. Prophecy is also a pattern. So an event can happen more than once and still be the fulfillment of a particular prophecy. So Daniel's given this vision, these instructions about this event, which happens in the early 100s, which actually means numerically late, like 100, not like 110, which is early, like 190. That's early. Timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly. Messes with your head. Anyway, the event happened before Jesus makes reference to it, and here's why that's important. I know it's like you're talking in circles. What's going on? Well, this Old Testament we've been talking about, the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh, was translated from Hebrew into Greek by 70 scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, called the Septuagint. Septuagint means the 70. In the 270s, 250, it took some time, BC time frame. Okay, you with me? So it's they had it in another language, in hand before the event even took place. Well before Jesus came to fulfill that mathematical prophecy. Daniel also describes the geopolitical events of what are called the silent years, from the time of Malachi to the time Jesus came, this 400-year block. He is given an outline for the kings of the north, the kings of the south, the kings of the west, the kings of the east, which are the four kingdoms that came up after Alexander the Great died and passed it to his four generals. He's given an outline of who marries who conquers who, and it's so accurate that, again, people think that somebody went in after the fact, scribbled it all in there, when, in fact, they had it in the Septuagint. They had it in hand, like, during and also before all of that stuff was going on. Like, there's so many things like that. It shows that this text came from outside of our reality, came not from the mind of man, not from the heart of man, but from the heart and mind of God, through men, through people, to us today. The close with a couple of thoughts that I have written down in my notebook because I didn't get them written into the computer here. One could say there's so many ways to talk about the Bible or to talk about the Old and New Testament. The Old Testament largely has to do with origins, the beginning of things. Like I said, it's the beginning of the Testament. It's the beginning of the covenant, while the New Testament is the conclusion. It's the ending of all. In Genesis, you have the origin of sin. And not just an act of sin, but a sin nature. We don't sin and become a sinner. We sin because we are sinners, because it's in us, because we inherited that from Adam and Eve. Like, children are innocent and they're so good and they're so sweet. I've raised 2 humans, and I've been a little human myself and heard the stories about myself. And you don't have to teach kids to be bad. You don't have to teach them to be a sinner. You have to teach them how to be good. You have to teach them how to follow directions. You have to teach them respect. You have to teach them obedience. Those are the things you have to teach them. We're born sinners. That's just a reality. It's not an action problem, it's a nature problem. Nothing we can do on our own can change our nature because the problem is inside. We can't fix ourselves. This fix has to come from the outside. The only way to fix this sin problem is, and the way for salvation to happen is for sacrifice. So not only is the Old Testament the origin of the documented origin of sin, it's also the origin of sacrifice, the origin of salvation. All of that's spelled out as to what that's going to look like, what it did look like before Jesus even came. A sacrifice that saves someone requires innocence. This is why, when I sin and the cost, the price of sin is death, my own death doesn't pay off my sin. I can't sacrifice myself to then earn salvation. Can't do anything before I die to earn salvation because the cost is my death. That's it. Once I've died, it's even. I'm not saved. It's not more than. It's just price has been paid. That's it. You're done. It requires innocence, which a sinner is not innocent. This is why when God set up his system, it's a lamb. What did the lamb do? Nothing. It's innocent. That's why it is the cost. That's why it is the sacrifice for sin. Jesus was innocent. He is the sacrifice. His blood shed, his innocent blood shed, overcomes the cost of my sin, of your sin. And that's all spelled out in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, sacrifices covered sin, didn't erase them, covered them up so that they couldn't be seen. It wasn't until Jesus came that sin that was covered was finally washed away. Now for us, after Jesus, his blood doesn't just cover the sin, it washes it away automatically. So we kind of get to skip that whole thing. It's all about whether you're around before Jesus died or after Jesus died. But this is why it's sort of faith on both sides. People before Jesus had to look forward what God was going to do, whereas we look back on what Jesus already did, what God did through Jesus. Adam and Eve, even they couldn't. Their own death didn't cover them. Another animal died to then provide a literal covering for them, covering of skins. It's this picture that's throughout, and it's a beautiful picture. It really is. It's a beautiful, life-giving, guilt-freeing, Like, I can't do it on my own. No, stop trying. Instead, just accept the sacrifice that God himself provided, because yours doesn't work. Not enough. Can't be good enough. Can't be smart enough. And gosh darn it, God likes me. Yes, I know. Doesn't work. So that's why the Old Testament's important. It tells us what sin is, tells us where sin came from, tells us why we're dealing with it today, and it tells us God's plan to deal with it for eternity. So we can't just dismiss it. We can't just ignore it. Oh, you can't go back to that old. So much of it teaches us about what Jesus did, who Jesus was, that if you ignore it, you're ignoring Jesus. So there's my rough, super rough, first time trying this, 30,000 foot view of the Old Testament. I hope it's been helpful. Please contact me with any questions. If you see this on Facebook, if you see this on YouTube, you can email me directly. That was sort of Porky Pig-like. You can email me directly at Corby, C-O-R-B-Y, at Corby Stephens, CORBY-STEPHENS.com. And do my best to answer them individually. We'll put them into the Q&A that's in week 4 of all of this, and we'll go from there. So thank you again so much for watching, and God bless you guys. Bye-bye.